Jessica Owens, a 28-year-old woman, had vanished without a trace. The people of Maplewood, a small town in Georgia, were used to hearing about crime in the big cities, but not in their quiet church-going community. When word spread that Jessica was missing, the town came together in a way that only a tight-knit Christian town could. At the center of it all was Pastor Nathaniel Hayes, a beloved figure known for his powerful sermons and dedication to his church, the River of Grace. Pastor Hayes was the first to organize a community-wide search for Jessica. He stood in front of the congregation that Sunday morning, his deep voice echoing through the packed church. "Jessica is one of us," he said, his eyes filled with emotion. "We must pray for her safe return and do everything in our power to bring her home." The crowd murmured in agreement. Jessica had been attending the church for the past 2 years, a sweet young woman, friendly but private, with a smile that could light up a room. No one could understand why she would suddenly disappear. The town mobilized. Volunteers combed the nearby forests and abandoned properties, searching for any sign of her. Flyers were posted on street poles, grocery store walls, and even gas stations outside of town. The church held nightly prayer vigils, with Pastor Hayes leading emotional sermons, urging people to have faith that Jessica would be found. But behind closed doors, Pastor Hayes and his wife Evelyn were living in fear, because they knew exactly where Jessica was, and they knew she was never coming back. 48 hours earlier, Jessica had been sitting in her car outside the pastor's house, her hands shaking as she scrolled through her phone. The message was still there. "We need to talk. I can't keep this secret anymore." She had sent it to Pastor Hayes 2 hours ago. He hadn't replied. Jessica had been involved with him for almost a year. It had started as something innocent, private counseling sessions, a shoulder to cry on, but it had quickly turned into something more. Nathaniel had promised her that he loved her, that he would leave his wife, that they would build a life together. But now everything had changed. Jessica had just found out she was pregnant, and she wasn't going to be his secret anymore. Her phone vibrated, a message from him. "Come inside. We need to talk. Evelyn is out for the evening." Jessica took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, her heart pounding. But what she didn't know was that Evelyn was still inside, and she wasn't alone. Detective Laura Mitchell had been with the Maplewood Police Department for 10 years. A seasoned investigator, she had worked dozens of missing person cases, and she knew one thing for sure: people didn't just vanish. When Jessica's roommate, Rachel, reported her missing, Laura was assigned to the case. The first thing she did was check Jessica's last known whereabouts. Her phone records showed that her last message had been sent to an unknown number, not listed in her contacts, but Laura quickly traced it. It belonged to Pastor Nathaniel Hayes. Laura frowned. A pastor? She had dealt with all kinds of criminals, drug dealers, thieves, domestic abusers, but she hadn't expected a religious leader to be involved. Still, it was just a message. It didn't mean anything. Yet, she decided to pay him a visit. Pastor Hayes welcomed Detective Mitchell with a warm smile when she arrived at the church. He was the picture of calm and concern. "Detective, thank you for coming. I've been praying for Jessica's safe return." Laura studied him carefully. He was good, very good. The concern in his voice was genuine, his expression full of sorrow. But Laura had seen enough liars in her career to know that just because someone looked innocent didn't mean they were. "Pastor Hayes," she said, pulling out her notebook, "I understand that you were one of the last people Jessica contacted before she disappeared." The pastor nodded solemnly. "Yes, she was struggling with personal issues. I was counseling her. She reached out that night, but I was unavailable." Laura tilted her head. "Did you ever meet her that evening?" He shook his head. "No, detective. I wish I had. Maybe I could have helped her." Lies. Laura could tell. His voice was steady, but his eyes flickered, just for a second. She had seen that look before. She glanced around the church office. A framed photo of Pastor Hayes and his wife sat on the desk. Evelyn Hayes, the perfect pastor's wife, always supportive, always by his side. Laura made a mental note to speak with her next. As she left the church, something gnawed at her. This wasn't just a missing person case. This was something much worse, and Pastor Nathaniel Hayes was hiding something. Evelyn Hayes had spent 20 years perfecting the role of a pastor's wife. She was always poised, always supportive, and always present at every church function. The women in the congregation admired her grace, while the men respected her quiet strength. But what none of them knew, what she had spent years making sure they would never know, was that her marriage was built on a foundation of lies, secrets, and silent rage. She had given Nathaniel everything: her loyalty, her love, her devotion. She had stood by his side through every challenge, every scandal. And yet here she was, once again cleaning up his mess. And this time, it was murder. Detective Laura Mitchell arrived at the Hayes' home just after lunch. It was a picture-perfect house. White shutters, a well-manicured lawn, and a cross hanging above the front door. Evelyn opened the door with a warm, practiced smile. "Detective, welcome. I heard you spoke with my husband. Please come in." Laura stepped inside, immediately taking in the atmosphere. The house smelled like cinnamon and freshly brewed coffee, as if Evelyn had just finished baking. A perfect home, a perfect wife, but something felt off. "I won't take much of your time, Mrs. Hayes," Laura said as she pulled out her notepad. "I just have a few questions about Jessica Owens." Evelyn's face remained calm, but Laura caught the slight tightening of her jaw. "Of course," Evelyn said smoothly, leading her to the living room. "Such a tragedy. I've been praying for her safe return." She poured Laura a cup of tea and sat across from her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Laura wasted no time. "When was the last time you saw or spoke to Jessica?" Evelyn's eyes darkened, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, I didn't know her very well. She was a member of the church, of course, but my husband handled most of the counseling." Another lie. Laura sipped the tea, watching Evelyn closely. "Your husband mentioned that Jessica reached out to him the night she went missing. Were you aware of that?" Evelyn shook her head, offering a small, sad smile. "No, he didn't mention it to me. Nathaniel speaks to so many people in the congregation. He doesn't always share everything with me." Lie number 2. Laura glanced around the room. Everything was in its place. No signs of struggle, no missing furniture, no stains. But something about Evelyn's calm demeanor felt too controlled. "Do you have any idea where Jessica might have gone that night?" Evelyn sighed, lowering her gaze. "I wish I did. It's been weighing on me. I've been leading prayer groups every night for her." Another carefully crafted answer. She was good, but Laura had spent a decade breaking people down, and she knew Evelyn was holding something back. She just had to find the crack. As Laura drove back to the station, her phone rang. It was Officer Daniels, who had been assigned to comb through Jessica's phone records. "Detective, you're going to want to hear this," Daniels said. "Go ahead. We pulled security footage from a gas station near the church the night Jessica disappeared. Guess who was there around 9:30 p.m.? Laura's grip on the wheel tightened. "Tell me." "Evelyn Hayes." Laura's pulse quickened. "Did she meet with Jessica?" "Can't say for sure, but she wasn't alone. She was with her husband, and they were acting nervous." Laura's mind raced. Evelyn had just lied to her face. She claimed she knew nothing about Jessica's last contact with Nathaniel, but now there was proof that she had been with him that same night. They were hiding something, and Laura was going to find out what. Later that evening, Laura returned to the Hayes home, this time with a warrant. Nathaniel and Evelyn were both there when she knocked. Nathaniel answered the door, looking surprised but composed. "Detective? Back so soon?" Laura didn't smile. "I need to take a look around." Evelyn stepped beside him, her face a mask of calm. "Is something wrong?" "I have reason to believe Jessica was in this house the night she disappeared. If there's nothing to hide, then this won't take long." Nathaniel hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course, come in." Laura walked through the house slowly, scanning everything. It was spotless, just like before. But then something caught her eye. A door, a basement door, locked with a heavy padlock. Laura turned to them. "What's in there?" Evelyn's fingers curled slightly at her sides. "Just storage. Old church supplies, holiday decorations, nothing important." Lie number 3. Laura turned to Daniels, who was with her. "Cut the lock." Nathaniel stepped forward. "Detective, that's not necessary. Step back." Daniels broke the lock, and Laura pulled the door open. A narrow staircase led downward into darkness. A musty smell hit her nose. She pulled out her flashlight and took the first step, and as she descended, she saw it. The first sign that Jessica Owens had never left this house alive. A single blood-stained shoe lying in the corner of the basement, and beside it, a silver chain bracelet, the same one Jessica had worn in every picture. Laura turned back to face the couple. Evelyn's face was blank. Nathaniel was pale. She had them, and this was only the beginning. The silence in the basement was thick. The dim light from Laura's flashlight cast eerie shadows on the cement walls, making the room feel even colder. The blood-stained shoe and bracelet lay like damning evidence at her feet. Jessica Owens had been here, and now Nathaniel and Evelyn Hayes were no longer just concerned church leaders. They were suspects. Laura turned slowly to face them. Nathaniel's face had drained of all color, and Evelyn's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white. "Would you like to explain this?" Laura asked, her voice calm but firm. Evelyn didn't flinch. "I don't know how that got there." Nathaniel shook his head, stepping forward. "This is a mistake. Jessica was never in our home." Laura held up the bracelet. "Then how do you explain this? Jessica's family said she never took this off, but here it is in your basement." Evelyn took a shaky breath. "Maybe someone planted it." Laura narrowed her eyes. "And the blood-stained shoe. Did someone plant that too?" Nathaniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. The lies were starting to collapse under their weight. "I think it's time you both came down to the station," Laura said, gesturing to Officer Daniels. "We have a lot to talk about." Nathaniel started to protest, but Evelyn placed a hand on his arm. She looked at Laura, her expression unreadable. "We'll cooperate," she said. "We have nothing to hide." The police station was buzzing. News of Jessica Owens' disappearance had already caught local attention, and reporters were starting to circle. But inside the cold, sterile walls of the interrogation room, Nathaniel Hayes sat with his hands folded on the table, his jaw tight. Laura entered the room, setting a folder in front of him. She didn't open it. "Not yet." "Pastor Hayes," she said, pulling up a chair across from him. "I'm going to ask you one more time. What happened to Jessica Owens?" Nathaniel sighed, rubbing his face. "I told you, I don't know." Laura tilted her head. "You don't know? Then why was her bracelet and her shoe in your basement?" He swallowed hard. Maybe she came by and left them." "Maybe, Nathaniel." Laura leaned forward. "We pulled surveillance footage from a gas station near the church. You and your wife were seen there with Jessica the night she disappeared." His eyes widened, but he quickly covered his shock. "That doesn't prove anything." Laura finally opened the folder, pulling out a still image from the footage. Nathaniel and Evelyn stood in the parking lot, their faces tense, and Jessica was between them, looking anxious. "Jessica looked afraid," Laura said. "What did you say to her that night?" Nathaniel exhaled sharply. "She was upset. She wanted to talk about something private. We met her at the gas station, but then she left. That's the last we saw her." Laura tapped the photo. "So you admit you were with her that night?" Nathaniel nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but we didn't hurt her." Laura studied him. He was breaking down, but not enough. He was still holding back. "Tell me, Pastor," she said, watching his reaction closely. "Was your wife jealous of Jessica?" Nathaniel's face darkened. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in another room, her posture perfect, her hands neatly folded. She looked like she was waiting for Sunday service, not an interrogation. Laura entered, closing the door behind her. She placed the blood-stained shoe on the table. Evelyn didn't even blink. "That's Jessica's," Laura said. "Her blood, in your basement." Evelyn tilted her head. "And?" Laura sat down. "Your husband says you and Jessica had a disagreement that night." For the first time, Evelyn's expression shifted. "Did he?" "He said she wanted to talk about something private." "What was it?" Evelyn smoothed her skirt. "She was pregnant." Laura's breath caught. "Pregnant?" Evelyn nodded slowly. Jessica told Nathaniel she was carrying his child. The room fell into a heavy silence. "And what did you do?" Laura asked, her voice careful. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her lips curving slightly. "I prayed for guidance. And then, Evelyn's smile faded. And then I did what any good wife would do. Laura's stomach tightened. She knew. Evelyn had done something. Hours later, Laura sat in the observation room, reviewing the interviews. Nathaniel was lying, but he was scared. Evelyn, however, was something else entirely. Calm, composed, and dangerously in control. Laura turned to Daniels. She did it. I don't know how, but she did. Daniels nodded. We need a confession. Laura exhaled, thinking. Then an idea formed. Bring them in together. Minutes later, Nathaniel and Evelyn sat across from each other in the interrogation room, separated only by the table. Laura and Daniel stood nearby, watching. Evelyn just told us the truth, Laura said, looking at Nathaniel. Jessica was pregnant. Nathaniel's eyes flickered to Evelyn, his face stricken. You told them? Evelyn's lips curled slightly. Of course, darling. Honesty is important, isn't it? Nathaniel clenched his jaw. This isn't what happened in that basement, Laura pressed. Tell the truth now, or you'll both go down for this. Silence. Then Nathaniel broke. It was an accident. Evelyn's head snapped toward him. Nathaniel, but he was already talking. She came to the house that night, upset, screaming. Evelyn lost her temper. She pushed Jessica. She hit her. She wouldn't stop. Evelyn's eyes darkened, her composed mask slipping. Nathaniel, shut up. But he kept going. Jessica hit her head. There was blood everywhere. I panicked. We buried her. Laura's pulse raced. They had her. Evelyn's expression turned ice cold as she stared at her husband. You weak, pathetic man. Nathaniel swallowed hard. I loved her. Evelyn laughed softly. And that's why she's dead. Laura stepped forward. Where's the body? Evelyn stared at the table, silent for a long moment. Then she lifted her chin. Check the church. Laura's stomach turned. Where? Evelyn's smile was chilling. Under the pulpit. The church stood quiet in the night, its white steeple piercing the darkness. It was a place of worship, a sanctuary where people came to seek God. But tonight, it was a crime scene. Detective Laura Carter stood outside, staring at the building. A deep sense of unease settled in her chest. Inside this house of God, a terrible secret lay hidden. Behind her, Officer Daniels and a forensic team unloaded their equipment. The warrant had come through faster than expected. Nathaniel Hayes' confession and Evelyn's chilling last words had been enough. Under the pulpit, those words replayed in Laura's mind as she pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the church was still. The air smelled faintly of candles and old wood. Rows of pews stretched toward the altar, where a grand pulpit stood in the center of the stage. It was a place where Nathaniel had once preached about love, forgiveness, and salvation. Now it was where he had hidden a body. Start scanning the floor, Laura ordered. We're looking for disturbed wood or anything that looks out of place. Daniels and the forensic team moved quickly, their flashlights sweeping across the stage. One of the officers knelt, tapping the floorboards near the pulpit. Knock. Knock. Hollow. Laura's breath hitched. There. Two forensic techs set to work, prying up the wooden planks. It didn't take long before the smell hit them. The scent of decay, damp and sickly sweet, flooded the air. Someone gagged. Oh my God, one of the officers muttered. As the floorboards came up, the body was revealed. Jessica Owens lay wrapped in plastic, her face bruised and swollen. Her once vibrant eyes were closed forever, her lips parted as if caught mid-scream. Laura swallowed hard. Call the coroner, she said quietly. We found her. The team fell silent, staring at the lifeless young woman. A woman who had trusted the wrong man. A woman whose love had cost her everything. How long do you think she's been down here? Daniels asked. A forensic specialist knelt beside the body, examining the decomposition. At least a week. The humidity in this place slowed down the process, but it's definitely been a few days. Laura's jaw clenched. That meant Jessica had been killed almost immediately after she went missing. Nathaniel and Evelyn never planned to let her leave that house alive. Back at the police station, Nathaniel and Evelyn sat in separate holding cells, unaware that their secret had been uncovered. Laura decided to start with Nathaniel. He had already cracked once. Maybe he would again. She entered the interrogation room, carrying a single photo. It was a picture of Jessica's lifeless body, her skin pale against the black plastic. She placed it on the table in front of him. Nathaniel's eyes widened. "No." Laura crossed her arms. "You said you buried her. You lied." Nathaniel's breathing grew shallow. "Evelyn, she said no one would ever find her." Laura leaned forward. "Your wife hid her under the pulpit of your church, the place where you preached every Sunday. She made you stand above Jessica's dead body and pretend to be a man of God." Tears welled up in Nathaniel's eyes. "I didn't want this. I loved Jessica. I never wanted her to die." Laura's voice hardened. "Then why did you let your wife kill her?" Nathaniel looked away, shame washing over his face. "I was weak." "Weak doesn't make you a killer, Nathaniel," Laura said. "Tell me the truth. What really happened that night?" Nathaniel exhaled shakily. "Jessica came to the house that night. She told me she was pregnant, and she wanted me to leave Evelyn. She said she wouldn't keep our secret anymore." Laura remained silent, letting him talk. "Evelyn overheard us," he continued. "She lost control. She started screaming, calling Jessica a whore. She grabbed the fireplace poker and hit her before I could stop her. There was so much blood." Nathaniel wiped his face with his hands, his body trembling. "Evelyn told me we had to get rid of the body. She said if anyone found out, I'd lose everything. My church, my reputation. She made me help her." Laura's stomach twisted. "You didn't just help her," she said. "You lied to the world. You stood in that church and led prayers for Jessica's safe return, knowing she was dead beneath your feet." Nathaniel buried his face in his hands. "I deserve to rot in hell." Laura didn't disagree. Next, Laura stepped into Evelyn's holding cell. Evelyn was sitting calmly, her hands folded in her lap. Laura sat across from her, meeting her cold, unblinking gaze. "We found Jessica," Laura said. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Did you?" Laura slid the photo across the table. "Under the pulpit, the very place you and your husband stood and lied to your congregation." Evelyn barely glanced at the image. "A fitting place for a woman who tried to destroy my marriage." Laura's jaw tightened. "You have no remorse, do you?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Nathaniel was mine. I built him. I made him the man he is. And I wasn't about to let some little girl take him from me." Laura shook her head. "You destroyed him, Evelyn. You destroyed everything." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes dark and empty. "No, detective," she whispered. "I saved him." The trial was swift. Nathaniel Hayes was charged with accessory to murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His reputation as a pastor was shattered, his church abandoned, his name forever stained. Evelyn Hayes, the true mastermind, showed no emotion as she was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life without parole. Jessica Owen's family wept as they finally laid her to rest, knowing the truth but never understanding the cruelty that took her away. And Detective Laura Carter? She stood outside the church one last time, staring up at the steeple. The house of God had been tainted by sin, but maybe one day it would be cleansed. For now, justice had been served. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft murmurs of the spectators. The case of the state of Michigan versus Nathaniel and Evelyn Hayes had captured national attention. News reporters lined the front rows, their pens ready to document every detail. Jessica Owens had been laid to rest, but the scars her murder left behind were still fresh. The congregation of Grace Redemption Church was in shambles, divided between those who felt betrayed and those who refused to believe their beloved pastor had been part of such a crime. Detective Laura Carter sat in the back row, watching as the judge read the final sentences. Justice had been served, but the damage was irreversible. Nathaniel sat with his head bowed, his once proud posture reduced to that of a broken man. His orange jumpsuit swallowed him, a stark contrast to the expensive suits he once wore behind the pulpit. "Nathaniel Hayes, for your role in the cover-up and disposal of Jessica Owens' body, this court finds you guilty of accessory to murder. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Nathaniel let out a shuddering breath but didn't react otherwise. Then all eyes turned to Evelyn. She sat upright, her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression cold and unreadable. Evelyn Hayes, for the murder of Jessica Owens. This court finds you guilty of first-degree murder. You are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time, Evelyn blinked. A flicker of something crossed her face. Shock? Anger? Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes pleading. Evelyn, please. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence, as if he no longer existed. The gavel struck, case closed. Grace Redemption Church, once a pillar of the community, stood abandoned. The congregation had scattered, the faith of many shaken beyond repair. Some refused to believe their pastor could be involved, clinging to the idea that Nathaniel had been framed. Others were furious, disgusted by the deception and betrayal. The doors were locked, the sign out front removed. Laura drove past it one last time. In the end, the church hadn't just lost a leader, it had lost its soul. Inside the cold walls of Michigan State Prison, Nathaniel found himself utterly alone. His fellow inmates had no sympathy for a preacher who had spent his life preaching virtue while hiding sin. He spent his days in the prison chapel, but even God seemed silent now. He had traded his pulpit for a prison cell, his sermons for silence, his freedom for guilt. He had no one left, not even Evelyn. Evelyn was different. Unlike Nathaniel, she showed no signs of guilt, no regret. She walked into prison the same way she had lived, calm, composed, and unshaken. She never spoke of Jessica Owens, never spoke of Nathaniel. She had done what she had to do, and she would live with it. Jessica's parents stood in front of their daughter's grave. The headstone was new, the grass freshly laid. They had prayed for justice. They had found it, but it would never bring Jessica back. Her mother placed a single white rose on the grave. Rest now, baby. They can't hurt you anymore. Tears slipped down her face. But this time, they weren't just for sorrow. They were for closure. Laura sat in her car, staring out at the city skyline. This case had taken a toll on her, just like so many before it. But this one was different. It wasn't just about a murder. It was about betrayal. It was about how love could turn into possession, how power could turn into obsession, how a man of God could become a monster. She took a deep breath. Tomorrow there would be another case, another mystery, another truth to uncover. But tonight she would let this one rest. Jessica Owens had finally been found, and her killers would never walk free again. Nathaniel Hayes sat on the metal cot of his prison cell, staring at the cracked concrete wall. The once respected pastor of Grace Redemption Church was now nothing more than an inmate, a convicted criminal serving 25 years for his role in covering up Jessica Owens' murder. It had been 3 years since the trial ended, 3 years of solitude, regret, and the constant reminder that his wife, Evelyn, would never leave prison. Unlike him, she would never see the outside world again. But in those 3 years, something had changed. Nathaniel had started receiving letters from people who still believed in him, from people who wanted to know the truth. And one of those people was a journalist. Elizabeth Marsh had been following the Hayes case since the beginning. She was a young investigative journalist for the Detroit Post, and she had a theory. Nathaniel Hayes wasn't as innocent as he claimed. The evidence during the trial proved that Evelyn had killed Jessica, and Nathaniel had helped cover it up. But Elizabeth didn't buy it. She believed that Nathaniel had played a much bigger role in the crime than the courts had realized. So she wrote to him. At first he ignored her letters. Then curiosity got the best of him. He finally wrote back. Nathaniel's letters were careful. He never fully admitted to being involved in the murder, but he hinted at things that hadn't come up in court. Evelyn was always the stronger one, he wrote. She did what she thought was necessary, but she wasn't the only one who made decisions that night. Elizabeth sensed the cracks in his story. She continued pushing. Did you know Evelyn was going to kill Jessica? She asked in one letter. Nathaniel's response came weeks later. We all do things we regret. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. Meanwhile, Evelyn had adapted to prison life with eerie ease. She never spoke of Jessica. She never spoke of Nathaniel. In her mind, the past was dead. She had once been a devoted wife, a first lady of the church, a woman who stood by her husband's side as he preached to thousands. Now she was just another inmate, and she had accepted that. She was polite but distant, keeping to herself. Other inmates whispered about her, about the way she never seemed afraid, never seemed remorseful. "She don't act like a woman who regrets killing someone," one guard said. "She acts like a woman who'd do it again." One night, Nathaniel wrote another letter to Elizabeth. This time, he didn't hold back. "I love Jessica," he admitted, "but she was becoming a problem." Elizabeth's heart pounded as she read the words. "I didn't want her dead, but when Evelyn said she would handle it, I let her." There it was. Nathaniel Hayes, the fallen pastor, had just confessed. Maybe he hadn't pulled the trigger or swung the weapon, but he had allowed the murder to happen. And now, for the first time, he was admitting it. Elizabeth knew what she had to do. She had to take this to the police. But before she could, something unexpected happened. Nathaniel Hayes was attacked in prison. It happened in the middle of the night. A group of inmates had been waiting for the right moment. Nathaniel was walking back from the prison chapel when they struck. One held him down. Another pressed a sharpened piece of metal against his throat. "Preacher man," one of them sneered. "Let's see if God saves you now." Nathaniel struggled, begged, but mercy wasn't something these men offered. Just as the blade pressed against his skin, a guard's whistle blew. The attackers scattered, and Nathaniel collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. He had survived, but barely. After the attack, Nathaniel knew he had two choices: stay silent and risk getting killed in prison, cooperate with authorities and possibly get protection. He chose the latter. When the police came to question him, he didn't hold back anymore. He admitted everything: how Evelyn had planned the murder, how he had known about it, how he had helped cover it up, and how in the end he had let it all happen. His confession meant one thing: his sentence would increase. But at least he would be moved to a safer prison under protective custody. For Nathaniel, that was the best deal he could hope for. When Evelyn heard about Nathaniel's confession, she didn't react. She simply nodded and said, "I expected as much." Then she did something no one saw coming. She filed for divorce. Nathaniel Hayes sat alone in his prison cell, staring at the walls that now defined his world. His wife, the woman who had once stood beside him in church, in marriage and in murder, had officially filed for divorce. He had expected anger, maybe regret, but not silence. Yet Evelyn had said nothing. No messages, no letters, just a signed document severing their legal ties. After everything they had done together, she had walked away like he was nothing, like he had never mattered. And in that moment, Nathaniel realized something chilling. She had never truly loved him. The legal documents arrived in his hands a few weeks later. Irreconcilable differences. That was the reason Evelyn gave for the divorce. Not murder, not betrayal, not a lifetime behind bars, just irreconcilable differences. Nathaniel let out a bitter laugh. There was nothing left to fight for. No way out. His life was over. But Evelyn was still playing the game. Evelyn had spent years in prison observing, listening, and planning. She had no interest in wallowing in guilt or regret. Instead, she was focused on survival, and survival in her mind meant control. She knew Nathaniel had confessed. She knew he had betrayed her, but she wasn't worried, because in the end, she was the one who controlled the narrative. While Nathaniel had accepted his fate, Evelyn had begun working on an appeal. Evelyn's new legal team was ruthless. They painted a different picture, one where Evelyn was the real victim. They claimed Nathaniel was the true mastermind of Jessica's murder. Evelyn was manipulated into going along with it. Her confession had been coerced by the police under pressure. She had been abused throughout their marriage, forced to do things she never wanted to do. The story was a lie, but it was a convincing lie. And in the world of law, perception was everything. Nathaniel had thought he was making the right choice by confessing. He had believed that telling the truth would bring him peace. But now it was clear: Evelyn had won. She had turned everything against him. He had lost his marriage, his freedom, and now his reputation. The media no longer saw Evelyn as the cold-blooded killer she was. Instead, she was becoming a symbol of a woman trapped in a toxic marriage, a survivor. Nathaniel wanted to scream, but it was too late. His story was no longer his own. Months passed. The court reviewed Evelyn's appeal. The arguments were strong, the evidence shaky, and in the end, Evelyn's life sentence was overturned. She was granted a reduced sentence of 15 years with the possibility of parole in 7. Nathaniel, however, his deal with the police had secured his protection, but it had also extended his sentence. While Evelyn had an escape plan, he had only a lifetime of regret. 7 years later, Evelyn stepped out of prison. A new woman, a free woman. The media swarmed her, eager to hear her story. She didn't say much, just a simple statement. I have made peace with my past. Then she disappeared into the crowd. Where she went next? No one knew. But one thing was certain. She had survived. And Nathaniel? Nathaniel had been nothing more than a stepping stone in her journey. Nathaniel never saw Evelyn again, but he thought about her every single day. He wondered if she ever thought of him, if she ever regretted anything, if she ever truly loved him. But deep down, he already knew the answer. She hadn't. She never had. And now he would spend the rest of his days alone, haunted by the woman who had outplayed him in every way. Laura Carter sat in her office, staring at the case files one last time. The pastor, the wife, the mistress, the murder. It had all been solved. But something about it still left a bitter taste in her mouth. Evelyn had walked away almost free. Nathaniel had paid the highest price. And Jessica Owens? She had been forgotten. Laura sighed and closed the file. Justice had been served, but sometimes justice didn't feel like justice at all.